So now let's take a look at the ZBrush interface as a whole, so we can get an idea of what these menus are and where you're going to want to go to find certain things as we work through the rest of the DVD. The idea here is just to acclimate you to how the interface works and where general menus are going to be found. You don't need to remember where every menu is and what the contents of them are. The point of this particular lesson is to give you an overall wide snapshot of what you're looking at and how to actually navigate through this interface. The first thing you'll notice is when you start up ZBrush, there is a file menu down here at the bottom of the screen. It's a file browser called the Lightbox. And if I turn this on and off, it'll load that. The Lightbox is new to ZBrush 4. It allows you quick access to all the different file types available in ZBrush. You can load up projects, documents, tools, brushes, materials, textures, alphas, scripts, spotlights, as well as other objects. In this case, this is going to be just some files that are in here, some image files. We're interested in going to the Tool menu. I click Tool, scroll over here, and we'll double-click on the Dog Z tool, and that loads the Dog Z tool. If I click and drag in the document window, it drags the dog, or draws the dog there. Now if I continue drawing, it just draws more copies of the dog. What I need to do is I need to go into Edit mode up here at the top of the screen. That can be done by pressing the Edit button or pressing the T key on the keyboard. You'll notice in ZBrush, anytime you mouse over a menu option, it'll give you the hotkey. That's really, really important. It's nice to have that ability. So anytime you need to know the hotkey, just mouse over and it'll tell you if there's one assigned. So once I go into Edit mode, you'll see my cursor becomes red. It's a red circle now, and I can rotate around the last dog that I drew. These other dogs, they're not 3D objects anymore. They're actually dropped to the canvas. For all intents and purposes, they're 2.5D images. They're 2D images that have a depth bit in there to allow you to actually light and change the material settings and things like that. They're not going to be something that we can rotate around and sculpt on, so we want to get rid of them. We want to get them out of the way. And the way to do that is use the hotkey Control-N to clear the canvas. And what that's doing is it's actually just going to the Layer menu and clicking Clear. It's the same thing. So this is a tool in Edit mode in ZBrush, and it's in the Document window. The Document window is like your viewport in Maya. It's where all of your sculpting takes place. You can zoom out from it with this button here. You can scroll around it, set it to actual size, or you can anti-alias half size it. If you've got a larger document size, which you'll see how to do later on, you can actually half size it and it'll fill the screen but give you a really nice anti-alias look. And the perspective button here allows you to turn on perspective, and floor will turn on the floor grid. Navigation in ZBrush is a little tricky for the very beginner, but you'll catch on pretty quick if you just give it a few tries. To move around the object, all you need to do is click and drag, and it rotates. To move the object, hold down Alt, click and drag on the background, and it drags it around. To zoom, hold down Alt, click and hold your mouse button, your left mouse button. Now let go of Alt and drag the mouse while you continue to hold down the left mouse button, and it zooms in and out. So again, that is hold and press Alt, hold and press the left mouse button, let go of Alt, and now move the mouse. See, that's the only one that I find tricky for beginners, and it's really just a rhythm. Once you get the feel for it, you're able to do it very quickly. The first few times, it's going to feel a little strange. You'll probably stumble over it. That's okay. It does come very quickly. You do get the feel for that within about a day of using ZBrush, and then you're fine. If you do want something to fall back on, there are these navigation buttons down here on the right side sidebar. Move is the same as Alt-clicking. Scale is the same as zoom. Rotate is the same as clicking and dragging on the background. If you want to recenter your model, if it's off screen maybe, just press the F as in Frank or focus key, and it refocuses the model. So the menus themselves, we've done a little bit of work over here on this right sidebar. There is a left sidebar. The right sidebar deals mostly with navigation buttons and display buttons. You can control, for example, the rotational axis. You can turn on and off the polygon frames on the model. You can turn on and off transparency, which is only visible if you're working with a model that's got multiple subtools. So for example, if I open up the demo soldier here, who has multiple subtools, and if I turn on transparency, you can see that allows me to see through the inactive subtools to the active one. The sidebar here on the left deals with your tool, with your brushes, your materials, your alphas. These are the tools that you will use to apply to the model. For example, if I open up this icon here, this opens the brush palette. These are all the brushes that are available in ZBrush that are loaded by default. The stroke menu here controls how the brushes affect the surface. For example, the freehand stroke allows you to draw with the brush like you would with a pencil or a pen, whereas the drag rectangle stroke functions more like a stamp. The alpha menu is accessible here. I mean, this is the alpha palette, and these are kind of abbreviated versions of the main menus that are up here. Anything down here in the interface is actually being pulled from up here in these top menu bars. The alpha menu, for example, is just right here. There's the same alpha palette located under the alpha menu, but you'll notice there's far more options here under the regular alpha menu. The purpose of these buttons here are just to allow you to quickly go select a new brush, select a new stroke, select a new alpha or a texture, and then start using it. So it's just here for speed. The idea is by having all of your tools over here on the left-hand side, your sculpting tools, your strokes, your alphas, your textures, you can very quickly move over, make a selection, and then move back to the model. The idea is to allow you to have to traverse the least amount of distance away from your work, so you can constantly be here working and just grabbing the tools that you need. Pixelogic wants to keep you from having to go hunting through the interface for things up here, breaking your flow of concentration. So on the left bar, you've got the brush menu, the stroke menu, the alpha menu, the texture menu, and then the material menu. Now the material menu, I'm opening it up here because I just want to change my material. I don't want this red wax shader right now, so I'm going to come over here and I'm going to select this basic material. And you'll see that changes the look of everything on the model. It all becomes this nice gray shader. It's a little bit reminiscent of maybe a Blinn or a Lambert shader. There's a color picker here that allows you to select a color. This is going to be very useful when we're painting textures on the model. And here we've got the two color swatches. There's the secondary color and the primary color. You can switch between them by using the switch color button, and you'll notice that there is a V there for switch colors. That's the hotkey that I manually set, and you'll see how to make hotkeys later on in the DVD. I can just switch my colors like that. Now down here there's the system palette button. This is not going to be in your interface because this is something that I customized. I created this just for my interface by going up here to the color menu and dragging system palette out and down and docking it here. We'll talk about how to customize your own interface with hotkeys as well as placing buttons down here in the interface later on in the DVD. If we come up here to the top bar, so I call this the left sidebar, this is the right sidebar, and then we've got this top bar up here. And again, this top bar is full of quick access buttons which really do just all come from these main menus up here. The purpose is to have them pulled down in the interface for ease of access. So there's three buttons here, and these are three different Z scripts. There's Projection Master, which is a texturing tool, Lightbox, which we've seen is this file browser down here, and then Quick Sketch, which is just a sketching Z script. It allows you to sketch interesting shapes in the document window. The only ones here that we'll end up using really are Lightbox and Projection Master. Quick Sketch doesn't come into play very often, if at all, for doing models and textures. The Edit button we've seen. This allows you to enter into edit mode. If I turn off edit mode, you'll see my brush now becomes white, and instead of sculpting, it just draws more copies of the model. You want to avoid that. And as you're working in ZBrush, you may find that suddenly it starts doing this. And what's happened is, usually you've just accidentally tapped the T key. If you press T again, you'll see it goes into edit mode. The last model you drew pops into edit mode, and you can rotate around it. And to get rid of everything down here that's dropped on the canvas, use the hotkey Control-N, or just go to Layer, Clear. And that's going to be really useful for you. And in about 6 years of teaching ZBrush, I've really noticed that that's a very common problem for people, is that every once in a while they'll end up with something snapshot to the canvas, or they'll end up with, an image stuck to the background like this as they're working, which is pretty frustrating if you don't know how to get rid of it. So just remember, you can go to Layer, Clear, and that knocks out everything in the background. Draw mode allows you to draw with your brush. You can be in draw mode, or you can be in move, scale, and rotate mode. Draw mode is for sculpting. Move, scale, and rotate are transpose modes. These allow you to move, scale, or rotate subtools in relation to each other. So if I'm in move mode here, and if I draw my brush out, I end up with this orange line. This is called a transpose line. That allows me to move that body subtool independently of the other subtools. If I go to scale, I can scale him, and we'll talk further about these transpose tools later on. Don't worry that we're kind of going quickly showing them. I don't want to get into the specifics of them. I just want it to be clear what they do. If I go into rotate mode, I can rotate this guy in relation to these other subtools. So basically what this does is it allows me to move, scale, and rotate one subtool, whatever the active subtool is, in relation to the others. It's very useful when you're trying to place objects in a scene. For example, these accessories on the demo soldier would be created, and then their placement would be fine-tuned using these move, scale, and rotate tools. I can't sculpt while I'm in this mode. If I want to go back into sculpting mode, I go back to draw, and you can see the hotkey for that is Q. So now I go back into draw mode, and my brush becomes red, and I can start sculpting again. The next set of controls here govern how the brush applies to the surface. So you've got mRGB, RGB, and M. You can have any one of these selected, and what these mean are mRGB will apply both color, RGB, and material, M. RGB applies just color, and then M applies just material. And you can control the intensity of the color that's being put down with the RGB intensity slider here. More importantly, you're going to find Z add and Z sub. These control whether or not your sculpting brush is adding, Z add, or subtracting, Z sub. And the Z intensity slider will control the intensity. I always keep Z add on, and I use the Alt key to determine whether or not it's adding or subtracting. For example, if I'm using the standard brush and then sculpting on a surface, let's grab a polygon sphere here. Coming down here into the Lightbox menu and grabbing the polysphere. Here you can see I'm adding with my brush. I'm using the Clay Tubes brush, and that's adding to the surface. Now if I press the Alt key, see that little minus sign that suddenly appears? That means that I'm in subtract mode. So it's just like turning on Z sub, except I don't have to come up here and change between Z add and Z sub every time I want to add and subtract. You're always going to have your thumb on the Alt key because that's how you're navigating in ZBrush. So by pressing Alt, remember that that turns your brush into Z sub. Letting go, you're at Z add again. I cluster all of my hotkeys and all of my around the Alt key because my thumb is always going to be there. I press it to subtract, let go to add, I press it to navigate. It's really where the anchor point for my hand on the keyboard as I'm working. So I try and take advantage of that and cluster all the hotkeys that I set around that left side Alt button. Assuming you're left-handed, it could be the right side Alt button. So these brush controls up here, they're actually being pulled from the Draw menu. As you can see, there's the draw size and Z intensity and RGB controls. These are all things that are coming from these top menus up here, but Pixelogic has placed them down here in the main window for ease of access. So it's very quick and easy for you to go up here and control the draw size. The focal shift, which is the center red button that controls the fall off of the brush. The intensity controls. If you want to access these while you're down here in the menu, there's some hotkeys that you want to know. There's S, that brings up the draw size. There's U, which brings up Z intensity. Now that U control is actually pretty far away. That means I have to move my hand way over to get the Z intensity control, and I try not to do that. So what I like to do is use one menu that has them all clustered together. And I'll do that by pressing the space bar. And this is my workhorse menu. I will use this constantly, and it allows me access to just about everything that I need for the most part without ever having to leave my model. This is called the quick menu. You can see that it's got everything from this left sidebar right here is right there. It's got just about everything from the right sidebar right here. And it's got all the important menus from the top right here. It even has the color controls, which come in pretty handy when you're painting. So as I'm working, I'll just tap the space bar and I can access any of the menus that I might need right there at my fingertips. And that's really important when you're working in ZBrush, is to minimize the amount of space you have to traverse through the interface. Anytime you move away from the model, you're losing time and you're losing focus. So if you can stay right here on model and keep working, you're going to find that that's actually going to speed you up and make it easier for you to stay focused on your work and get better results. In my experience, at least, it's best to work that way. And that's the space bar. That is the quick menu, and you access that with the space bar. I'm going to load up the dog again. There we go. So now we've looked at the main parts of the interface. The left sidebar with your brush, material, and alpha menus and others. The right sidebar, which gives you access to navigation controls. There's a quick button for rendering here. We've looked at the dock on the right side, where you can dock your menu interface items. For example, if I dock the alpha menu, I can scroll through here and access all the sub-menu controls for the alphas. If I click this little radio button, it'll close that. If I click that, it completely closes it, and the dock is now empty. The top menu bar, this is where all the root menus are. All these buttons, everything down here in the interface, they're all coming from different menus up here. This top bar, this is sort of the file menu in most Windows applications where you get file, edit, view, etc. This is your top bar menu. This is just where all the options are located. Now really, with this menu, it's easy to get overwhelmed because you look up here and you see all these options, and just very quickly, I'm going to point out that you will use the alpha menu very often. You'll use the brush menu very often because that's how you control all the settings for your brush. You will go in here to control things like, surface and orientation and the modifiers and the auto masks, especially. There's auto masking. These things are all going to come into play when you're customizing your brushes. But you'll really spend most of your time accessing your brushes through here. The color menu you're really not going to use very often unless you're painting, and that's only to select color. And mainly you'll be using this palette here. The document window allows you to control the size and orientation of your document window here. It's not a menu that you use very often, nor is the draw menu, because most of the important things in the draw menu you're going to find down here in the interface. There are exceptions which we'll look at as they come up, but really I just want to sort of demystify this top menu bar so you realize that while there's a lot here, there's not a lot you're going to find yourself using on a daily basis. The edit menu really just allows you to undo and redo, and you can do that with Control Z. The file menu is just like what you find in Windows. This allows you to save and open files, and by default ZBrush is saving projects. So if you click Save As, it'll save a project file. And what that does is it saves everything you've got here. It saves every Z tool you have open, any textures you have, any keyframes in the timeline. It's an all-purpose save file format. It will save everything that you've got that you've been working on, and it's probably the best way to save. Just go to File, Save As. You can also save just an individual tool. You can save timelines and spotlights, which we'll look at later on in the DVD. But really the best thing to do is just always save a project, because it saves everything. Spotlights you'll need to save separately. Everything else saves with your project. The layer menu you're not really going to use very often other than to click the clear button. The light menu is pretty cut and dried. It just allows you to select and move your lights around, and we'll look at that in more detail when we render. The macro window allows you to record macros. They're sort of like Z scripts that you do by recording your actions and playing them back. It's not a menu that you'll find yourself using very often, but it's there for your exploration if you're interested in trying to automate some things. The marker menu is not a menu that's used very often. The material menu you will use when you're going in to change the settings on your materials, but that's really mainly when you're rendering. The movie menu, you're going to be using this to access your timeline. The timeline allows you to create animations in ZBrush and store variations. You can see there's the timeline there. You can also use the movie menu to create rotational videos and time lapses directly out of ZBrush. The picker menu controls how the brush affects the surface, and it's a specialty menu that you're not really going to use often. The preferences menu is the user preferences. This allows you to set up all of ZBrush's internal preferences. And there's important menus in here we will discuss later, but it's not a menu that you'll use often at all. The render menu allows you to control the rendering options like shadows and anti-aliasing and subsurface scattering. The stencil menu is something we'll talk about when we're dealing with alphas. It's a way of detailing the surface, and it is a specialty menu that doesn't come up very often. The stroke menu allows you to control how your brush affects the surface. Really, mainly you'll be using these options here, which you find in the stroke menu here. Later on, we'll talk about some of the more specialized stroke controls like lazy mouse, but for the most part, you're going to be dealing with this version of the stroke menu here, which is more abbreviated and to the point. It gives you the bare bones options that you need to work. The texture menu will come up when we're texturing. It allows you to import and export textures into ZBrush and load them into the spotlight. Now the tool menu, this is our workhorse menu. I'm going to click this little radial button and tear it off. The tool menu allows you to access everything that deals with the current subtool you're working on. This is where you're going to be able to do things like adding subtools, like you saw with the demo soldier. Every one of those little pieces is a different subtool. This also allows you to add geometry. And this is a big deal with ZBrush because in ZBrush it's all about adding detail, being able to sculpt your form, and the only way to do that is if you've got subdivision levels. And the geometry menu here is where you step up and down your subdivision levels. So if I'm at the highest subdivision level and I want to add a new one, I click the divide button here under the geometry menu, under the tool menu. You'll notice the hotkey for that is Control D. Control D will add a new subdivision level. If I want to step down, I can use the sliding slider here. I can slide this bar up and down to go through my subdivision levels. Or I can press D to step up subdivisions, and then Shift D to step down. So D steps up, Shift D steps down, and if you're at the highest subdivision level, Control D will add a new subdivision level. And just as a note right now, as you work, try and avoid adding subdivision levels. The big pitfall that new ZBrush users fall into is they add too much geometry too soon. Always try and figure out if the form you're sculpting can be created at a lower subdivision level, and if it can, step down to that level. Because by working on the lowest possible subdivision level at all points during your sculpture, you're going to create more natural, more beautiful form, because you're not going to get that lumpy quality that you might see in some beginner ZBrush sculpts. That lumpiness is because you're trying to move around too much geometry to make a simple shape. Also under the tool menu, you'll find many options for masking. You're going to find the options down here for creating displacement maps and normal maps. And these are all things we'll go into in much detail later on. Suffice it to say, the tool menu here is really the main menu that you'll spend probably the most of the time navigating through, because it allows you access to all the different attributes of this particular tool that you happen to be working on. The transform menu you're not going to use very often because all of these options are really accessed down here in the top bar. The zoom menu is not one that's used really at all. I've never used this button in all my years of ZBrush. It zooms into the document window, and it was really mainly used for when people were doing illustrations directly in the document window. The Z plugin menu is where all of your third-party Z scripts will be loaded when you load those up. You'll find them under the Z plugin menu. You'll notice I have menus here that you don't have if you're using a new ZBrush install. That's because I've just installed all the plugins available for free from Pixelogic, and we'll talk about doing that later on as well. Then lastly, there's the ZScript menu, which only comes into play if you want to program ZBrush. You use ZScript in the ZScript menu to create your own plugins and your own scripts. So that is the overall interface. That is a brief walkthrough that gives you a generalized idea of what these menus are and what they're used for. You now understand that in the document window, this is where our tool loads up, where we go into edit mode and sculpt. This left sidebar allows you to access your materials and textures and alphas and strokes. The right sidebar allows you to navigate. The top bar allows you to control your brush. The top menu is where all the root menu options are found. And then the right side dock is where you're going to be able to tear off and dock menus for ease of access if you just want to keep them open so you can work in them. And just to revisit navigation one more time, if you want to rotate around your model, click and drag on the background. If you want to zoom, Alt, click, drag, then let go of Alt and you'll zoom. If you want to move the model, just Alt, click, and drag. If you want to refocus, press the F key to recenter the model. To access your quick menu, press the space bar. If you want to step down your subdivision levels, you can either go to the geometry menu here under the tool menu, or you can use Shift D to step down. I recommend using these hotkeys, by the way. Try and avoid just coming to the geometry menu because it's a waste of time and motion to move over here and work like this. Shift D steps you down. D will step you up. And then to add a new subdivision level, when you're at the highest level, Control D adds a new one. Now, if you find that you've added too many subdivision levels, which if you follow my advice, you will find a few times as you're starting out working in ZBrush that you've got too many subdivision levels and you need to step down and get rid of the higher ones. All you need to do is step down to the lower level, then just click Delete Higher. And that'll delete all those higher subdivision levels. Now, those are gone forever, so only do that if you definitely want to get rid of those higher subdivision levels. So that completes this overall look at the ZBrush interface. You've got a general idea now of what each section is for and where to go to find different types of objects. You're going to go and find very specific menus later on in the DVD, and we'll continue to explore the interface in more depth as it becomes necessary. But for right now, the purpose of this lesson is just to give you an overall bird's eye view of what everything is, as well as how to navigate. So just to touch on navigation one more time before we move on. If you want to zoom, you Alt, click, and hold the left mouse button. Let go of Alt and you can zoom. If you want to rotate, left click and drag. If you want to move, hold down Alt, left click and drag. The F as in focus key refocuses the model, recenters it on screen. To step down your subdivision levels, you press Shift D. To step up, you press D. And when you're at the highest subdivision level, press Control D to add a new subdivision. Shift D steps down, D steps up, Control D adds a new subdivision. If I go into the geometry menu here under the tool menu, you can see there are my subdivision levels in menu form. I can use the slider to move up and down. I can also add a subdivision level using the divide button here. So now we've got enough information to move on into the next lessons. I don't want to overwhelm you with too much about the interface. As these menus become important, we'll start to look at them and open them and get a more in-depth view of them. But for right now, you should have the ability to easily navigate around and get a feel for how ZBrush functions and how you should be navigating the screen. So let's go ahead and move on to the next section.